officially due to start at 20 past, and we've got a 10-minute introduction, so I think I better crack on so we can get through everything. So my name's Catherine Jones. I'm from the Wales Autism Research Centre at Cardiff University, and I'm co-chairing this sensory event with Damian Milton from the University of Kent, so welcome to all of you. I have some housekeeping points just to run through. These were provided by Autistica, so if you can just bear with me and pay attention. So people are welcome to leave at any time. If you do leave and want to return, then you will be asked to wait for an appropriate moment in terms of swapping between speakers, just so disruption's minimized. Just remember the session is being recorded. Please be understanding of the wide range of understanding of backgrounds of audience members and of our speakers. You may disagree with somebody or how they say it, and that's fine. But just bear that in mind, keep things civil and so on. Please don't interrupt if someone is speaking, and there is time at the end of every talk for clarifications and questions, though the time for questions, to be honest, is limited. So you may want to find your speaker later or perhaps a follow-up after the conference. Please be considerate of those around you, and for those of you who tweet, the hashtag is DiscoverConf, so discover and then CONF, if you want to share what you are learning and your thoughts about the event. The other thing to say, we've got 6 speakers, but they're speaking for different lengths of time, so just to bear that in mind. Somebody might give a very short talk. That's because they were told to give a very short talk, not because they've run out of things to say. And it's a real challenge to give a 5-minute talk, so congratulations in advance to those people. Okay. So, we've been asked both to say just a few words to set things off. I have 4 minutes to do that. I was going to say 2 things, and I thought that was way too ambitious. I'm just going to make 1 point. And my point really is that I think this is a really exciting time for sensory processing research in terms of the amount of work that's now being produced on the topic. So subjectively as a researcher, I feel a lot is coming out. And prior to this event, I thought, well, I will test my intuition and see if genuinely there is more research going on at the moment. So I did a very crude search of academic database of sensory research on autism that have been published over the last 30 years and compared it to 2 very popular topics in autism research, face processing and theory of mind, which is all about perspective taking. And I plotted those on a graph. I mean, I didn't verify all of these papers, but I think the data is clear enough and speaks for itself. So here we have number of publications, and here are the 3 decades of research. And first, it's great to see a lot more autism research is going on now than it was in the 1990s. But you can see very early on, hardly any sensory research at all in the 1990s, maybe 10 or so papers a year. In the 2000s, things are starting to change. Here's sensory in the navy. But it's certainly the poor relation of theory of mind and face processing which is really taking off. And I think that might be partly to do with very interesting methodologies that were developed in this era that lent themselves to face processing, things like neuroimaging and eye tracking technology being advanced and so on. But then if we come to the current decade, it's really clear that sensory processing is having its moment. It's really starting to take off. And just last year, the amount of publications in face processing compared to sensory processing actually were more or less indistinguishable. So, yeah, the point really is that there's a lot going on at the moment. And you'll notice I flagged up DSM-5. So this is the diagnostic manual, or one of the international manuals for diagnosis. And they introduced in 2013 sensory processing for the first time. Now, this was obviously reflecting what was already going on in research, a lot of publications profiling the sensory differences in autism, and obviously also reflecting a lot about what autistic people were very eloquently saying about their experiences in the sensory realm that needed to be recognised. But I also think that this event has had the effect of really energising research in this area and giving, checking the time, and giving a really good impetus to encourage researchers to continue on this path and to get funding And, you know, Autistica themselves, it's one of their 10 priorities, which was influenced by autistic people. So I want to start on a really positive note to say there's a lot more research going on now in sensory processing. If you want to project ahead, I think things could look even better. And hopefully this is the chance now for some real step change in our understanding of sensory processing and the ways, and using that research to help autistic people live better lives. So I'm going to hand over to Damian now, if you've got a few words to say.
Hello everyone. I'd just like to say I'm very glad to see more research going into this area. It's about time we had this spike, as it were. And it affects me personally. I'm autistic myself, and I have a teenage autistic son who'd be classified as having severe learning disabilities. And both of us have quite extreme sensory perceptual differences, which bring a lot of discomfort in our lives, but also a lot of joy. And I want to highlight that many of our interests and activities we like the most is partly due to the way we're processing sensory information and making sense of it. And I want to highlight the perceptual level that this works on. So my eyesight, for example, I guess would not be very much different to anyone else's here, other than it's going a little bit blurry reading stuff of late, so I might need to see the opticians for reading glasses. But the way one makes sense of that incoming information and makes sense of the world, to me, is fundamental to what autism is. And things like the social disjuncture and difficulties I see as coming out of these cognitive processing differences, as it were. So to me, this research is really fundamental if we're going to begin to really help people as well to navigate the sensory world. So I'm involved in a new project on sensory issues and assessments at the moment. So hopefully next year I'll be presenting some research up here. So, but at this point I'd like to hand over to our first speaker. So you want to introduce?
Yeah, brilliant. So our first speaker is Katy Unwin. Oh, yes, of course, just there. Right. Okay.
Thanks very much, and thanks Catherine and Damian for all of your insights. My name's Katy, and I'm really privileged to share with you some of my research today at Autistica. So my research has been on, broadly speaking, the use of sensory rooms with autistic children. And because this is the first talk in the sensory session, I did just want to highlight issues that actually Catherine and Damian have already brought up. So why do we study sensory processing in autism? Well, some research seems to suggest that up to 90% of individuals on the autism spectrum seem to have some sensory processing differences. So it's wide-ranging, and that's why it's important for one reason. And as much as there can be positive impacts to different sensory processing, as Damian described, also it can have a negative effect on behaviour. And it can have a significant effect on people's lives in terms of daily functioning. And so as researchers, we need to be engaging with this very important issue. But probably most importantly of all, it's important for the autistic community. So as part of a big survey that was produced and part funded by Autistica, they asked a group of autistic individuals what they believed was the best and most important things to be studied in the next 10 years. And sensory was one of the top ones. So it's important for the community. So now on to my PhD research. So I've been researching into the use of sensory rooms. They're also called multisensory environments, shortened to MSE, or also Schnazellen rooms. And here is a picture of quite a typical one. So this is the room that we have built at the Cardiff University Centre for Human Developmental Science. And I've just given some examples of some equipment that this sensory room has. So it's an environment that contains equipment that changes the sensory environment for apparently therapeutic or educational benefit. And this here is a bubble tube. It's about 2 meters high and contains water. Bubbles flow upwards and it can change colour. There's a certain amount of obviously sort of visual sensory input from the colour changing in the bubbles, but also there's auditory sensory input from the motor, creating a slight buzzing sound, and also if you touch it, there's some tactile sensory input from vibrations that come from the motor. So it's a very multi-sensory piece of equipment in and of itself. And then far across the end here, we have this far less technical piece of equipment called a tactile board, which is simply a board mounted on the wall that contains lots of different sensory pieces of equipment, I suppose tactile stimulation that individuals can engage with. And very importantly for this talk, a lot of the pieces of equipment can be controlled by the user or by the practitioner who uses the room with the user. And in terms of history, we know that from around the 1960s, people were beginning to use sensory experiences for individuals with varying disabilities, and they started to notice that there were therapeutic benefits to these sensory experiences. But then in the 1980s, these became, I suppose, more formalized in the use of these sensory rooms. Researchers in the Netherlands began to research into these rooms and produce them, and it was really from there that they became very, very popular. And that's really an important point here, that these are already widely used in special needs schools across the world, but specifically in the UK. And autistic children within these special needs schools are using these rooms regularly. Not only is there an economic cost to these rooms, they can be incredibly expensive, and that comes out of a school's budget. So it's really important we're researching them for that reason. But actually, even more importantly, children are being taken out of their classrooms and regular everyday learning interactions and being put into these sensory rooms. So it's important that for us as researchers that we are asking questions about how these rooms can be used to maximum benefit. An important question is, do these rooms work? But another important question is, how can they be used best, because they're already so widely used? And importantly, even though they're incredibly widely used with autistic individuals, there's very, very limited research. It's typically very poor quality, unfortunately, and there are very limited studies on the autistic individuals. The largest study on autistic children contained 6 participants, and there was no comparison group or comparison condition, so it was a descriptive study. So as you can see, this area is really ripe and important for research. So for my PhD, I adopted a sequential mixed methods approach, which means I started off with a qualitative study looking at sort of words and experiences of practitioners, so teachers and teaching assistants who have used these sensory rooms with autistic children. And I translated those findings then into a later quantitative study where I measured the behaviour of autistic children in these sensory rooms. So to give you a bit of background, so this is the process that I took, and it was a survey also. Within the interviews, I interviewed 10 practitioners on their experiences of use with autistic individuals, and I conducted a thematic analysis on the results that I received, and there really were 5 emergent themes from this data. So practitioners were keen to tell me that there were lots of benefits of these rooms for cognition, behaviour and mood, that there were distinct properties about these sensory rooms that could facilitate the benefits, but that it was important it was centred on the child's needs and their individual profile, that a practitioner has to play an active role in the use of these rooms for the maximum amount of benefits, and importantly, there were also challenges to sensory room use, which I thought was a really important theme because people seem to blindly accept that these rooms are beneficial. And so the fact that even the practitioners themselves acknowledge that there were lots of challenges is important to highlight. And although this was incredibly important information and insight from these practitioners, I wanted to see whether that extended to a larger group of practitioners. So what I did was I took items from these practitioner interviews and turned them into survey items, so statements about sensory rooms, and then I distributed that as a survey to ask a larger group of practitioners how much they agreed or disagreed with particular statements. On a 5-point Likert scale, and I got responses from 102 practitioners who very interestingly seemed to endorse everything that had come up in the interview quite highly, so that was important. So then I used this information to design my quantitative study using the sensory room with autistic children. So I used theme 1 to be able to define my outcome measures, because it's important that what I'm measuring from this sensory room is relevant for autistic children and not just sort of broad-ranging outcome measures that might not necessarily be relevant for their profile. And so the practitioners told me that they believed the sensory room brought benefits for focus and attention, mood state, repetitive sensory, motor and physical behaviours, and also social communication. So as you'll see in a later slide, all of these became my outcomes for the study. But then I also wanted to see what I could measure in the sensory room, because as I spoke about at the beginning, it's important that we ask how these rooms can be used for maximum benefit at this stage in the research process. And so I turned to theme 2, things the practitioners told me that were distinct about the sensory room that facilitated benefits. So they suggested that having control of the environment was beneficial, that it was a motivational space, that it provides a sensory stimulation, and also that it builds these relationships between peers and practitioners. I noticed when I looked at this theme that actually this very interesting outcome was at the control of the environment, because we know from the broader autism literature that actually an individual on the autistic spectrum has previously been described the benefit of having control of the environment. So these are from qualitative and also quantitative studies. And so we don't really know why that is. We think it might be about the predictability of sensory experiences that comes from being able to control them. But we thought this would be an interesting thing to measure in the study. And so that's what we did. So here was the study that we did. So I tested 41 autistic children in the sensory room. They were aged 4 to 12. I did an ADOS-2 assessment on all of them. And I also ran ability measures. And as you can see from the ability range, remembering that 100 is the mean, I had a very, very broad spectrum of autistic presentation represented in this study. So to take you through what I did, so the study was within subjects, so every participant used the sensory room twice in 2 different conditions with me. So in the first condition, they used the sensory room and they had sensory control using an iPad. So they engaged with each of these 5 pieces of equipment, each for 3 minutes in a sequential order, and these were randomized per participant. And in this sensory control condition, they had an iPad and they could control the stimulation they received from the equipment. But then in the other condition, the equipment passively changed for them. So they used the same equipment for the same amount of time in the same order, but they didn't have control over the stimulation they received from it. It just passively changed. And important to note, these were all video recorded so that we can include that very wide range of autistic presentation to be able to measure behavior. And these were counterbalanced, and also my utterances were controlled between both conditions. So here are the primary outcome measures. We had lots of different outcome measures, and I can't talk about them all today, but the primary one was this behavioral coding of the video data. So to begin with, we developed these coding schemes using these outcomes the practitioners had told me were possible from sensory room use. So we devised coding schemes to code for attention, anxiety, enjoyment, repetitive motor behaviours, sensory behaviour, social behaviour, and also speech. So all of these were coded using a program called Elan, which is where I watched the video, and then every time a behaviour that fit the criteria that was set was presented, it got coded. And we did a series of inter-rater reliability, and all of them were good to excellent, which means that we can trust that my coding was adhering to the coding scheme that we devised. So here were some of the results. So when the children, the autistic children, had control of the sensory room using the iPad, I found a reduction in repetitive motor behaviours, both in terms of frequency and duration. So in all of my graphs, the control condition is represented in the blue, and the no control condition is represented in the green. And I also found a reduction, interestingly, in sensory behaviours, so both in terms of the frequency of sensory behaviours and in terms of their duration. But I found an increase in attention in the control condition, and I also had some very interesting findings to do with the speech. So I found that child vocalizations and child stereotyped idiosyncratic speech both reduced in terms of frequency and also duration. So considering first this child vocalizations item, We are exercising extreme caution with this item because it included both communicative and also sensory vocalizations in one item. Because when you're video coding, it's very difficult to reliably dissociate what the intent of the vocalization was. And so we are interested in this finding, but we can't unpick it any further than that. But the child stereotyped idiosyncratic speech finding is very interesting because this is what we might describe as autistic type speech. So the use of neologisms, so newly coined words, and also reciting of non-personal facts, etc. And we found that that reduced in both frequency and duration in the control condition. But very importantly, we didn't see a subsequent increase in novel speech. So it wasn't that being in control of the sensory environment reduced this autistic type speech and increased novel speech, but actually just that speech was reduced in terms of that stereotyped idiosyncratic speech. So it's important that we remember that. So these are very interesting findings in this first study on the use of sensory rooms with autistic children, with a large sample of them. And so just to draw some conclusions from this study, the practitioner interview and surveys gave us incredible insight into the use of these rooms with autistic children, and they gave us the tools with which we could then design a study that measured what was important to measure. And we found that when the child had control of their environment, that there was a reduction in repetitive motor behaviours, sensory behaviours, vocalizations, and stereotyped idiosyncratic speech, but importantly, an increase in attention. But importantly, there was no change in mood, social communication, or arousal as measured by heart rate variability. So it's important to keep these findings in their context. So some limitations and future directions. So we're all aware of the broad profile of autistic presentation, and so a larger sample, if I'd been able to get it, would have enabled me to do very fine-grained individualized analyses, which I was prevented by only testing 41 children. But this study is the largest to date on children using sensory rooms. So not even autistic children, but children using sensory rooms. So it's really important for that reason. But importantly, these findings don't describe we don't know whether they'll extend to those with other different disorders, and importantly, whether other methods of use might also impact behaviour. So we've shown that giving the child control does impact behaviour to a certain extent, but would modulating the amount of perhaps interaction that I had with the child also change behaviour? That's a future study. Most importantly, though, we didn't measure the autistic voice. And it's really important to be understanding what the autistic children who are using these sensory rooms believe about them. And unfortunately, in this study, we didn't measure that. In future studies, we hope to include methods that might allow us to do this. But as you remember from an earlier slide, I did have some individuals who were minimally verbal, so we'd need to use some really innovative methods for this. But we're working on that at the moment for some future plans. In terms of impact, draw everything together, there's currently no guidance on best practice use of these MSEs, of these sensory rooms, and this study does provide us first insight into the use of these sensory rooms with autistic children. And hopefully, after a program of research in this area, we might eventually be able to provide some guidelines to practitioners who use these rooms with individuals who have autism, who very importantly use these rooms during their school day. So it's a really important thing for us to continue studying. So I want to thank wholeheartedly all of the families who took part, and also the practitioners who gave up so much of their precious time to take part in the study. To my supervisors, Dr. Catherine Jones here today, and also Dr. Georgie Powell, and then my future funders at the moment, the Waterloo Foundation, the Neuroscience and Mental Health Research Institute, and the School of Psychology at Cardiff University. Thank you very much.
Quick thank yous for that, and for mentioning predictability and the focus on control. I'll have to send you some stuff, but it makes perfect sense to me why that would be the case theoretically and so on. So it's interesting that that's coming out. We have time for a couple of questions at the back.
Thank you very much. I thought that was wonderful. I was really interested in. So these are kind of more observations. I am an academic in the literary field, so I don't have this level of expertise, obviously, that you have. But but I do have a child with autism who has sensory processing disorder as well. And two things that I thought were really interesting about the paper, well, and following on from that, is the use of them, or are practitioners not being trained to use them. So just yesterday we got a note home from the school saying we'd like to take the children to a sensory room. Will you agree this? We think it might be beneficial. But there's no underpinning what we're going to do in this room. So I think what you're presenting here is that sort of gap between practitioners knowing what to do, and my concern that in these rooms that actually there is just free flow, because there isn't, practitioners aren't trained to use them at an optimal level. So that's my main concern with this, which I'm taking from today. And the second point is that it's almost impossible, at least where I live, to get local authorities to recognise sensory processing and issues around sensory processing and funding interventions for children.
Yeah, thank you. It's such important points. I do completely agree. That was my finding, was that the limited amount of training they received, really, from the practitioners I spoke to, they found very frustrating as well. So they were all doing their absolute best, and I did speak to some incredibly experienced practitioners who talked about trying to work very hard to, through the process they call trial and error, of basically trying to use these rooms as best possible. And I think that's why we're really passionate about this research that looks at the ways we can use these rooms for maximum benefit, because at this stage the rooms really probably aren't going to stop being used because they're so wide-ranging and the schooling schools have them. So is there a way we can be using them that might actually be really beneficial for the children, and can we harness that somehow? So thank you very much for your experience. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
That's a very interesting talk. So I have a kind of a follow-up question about the sort of the mechanisms that you think are at play that make these rooms work for maybe some children, not for others, and maybe for some children in some ways and not in other ways.
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer for you, and I wish I could run a study that would look at that very specifically. And at this stage, we haven't run those studies, and the literature isn't available for me to say very specifically what the mechanisms are. In terms of my gut reaction at this stage, I think there is a definite effect of some individuals needing to be, I suppose, regulated is the best term. So for some individuals who really need a lot more sensory input, these rooms can provide that input when they're used in an appropriate manner. And for some individuals, they actually have too much sensory input. They experience what we describe as sensory overload. And so these rooms can be very contained and very dark, one piece of equipment, and that from the practitioners apparently was very important for a lot of their children who perhaps were overly reactive. And so that could be a mechanism that they're very adaptable. Apart from that, I don't know yet, but we're looking at a study that might be able to unpick whether it's the amount of sensory input that might be affecting. But thank you for your question. I wish I could give you a better answer.
I'm afraid we're out of time for questions.
Sorry, we're on our tight timetable. So I'm going to invite our next speaker now to come up and join us, which is Kirstie Whitaker.
Yes.
UK accessing your... Yeah.
So I'm going to start by playing a video that was made by Autistica, and I want to give you a heads up that it has some quite loud noises and some flashing lights. So if you want to take, it's about 1.5 minutes long, so if you just want to take any sort of time out, then do that for the 1.5 minutes. But I think it sort of positions the project that I'm going to tell you about really beautifully.
Sense right now. When you're autistic, the world has always seemed a bit, complicated. Don't get me wrong, there are times when we get it, or when people get us and see that our differences can be a good thing. But mostly we have to find our way in a world that wasn't built for us. The people, the chatter, the noises and smells, all the unpredictable stuff that we don't even notice, we notice all of it. Our minds are racing, trying to deal with everything hitting us all at once. The pressure builds and builds, it squeezes, it makes it hard to function. We find ways to cope, but it might be hard for you to understand. We're trying to fit in every day, because we have a lot to offer in this world. We need to understand these experiences. And research is finding ways to make our world a bit easier. But you can do your bit too, because if we understand more, we can build a better world.
Right, thank you for watching that with me. This is not my talk. Sorry. This is my talk. Here I am. I think my video's playing. Sorry. Oh, no. So sorry. Okay, so what I will use the rest of my sort of 3.5 minutes that are left of my time is to tell you about a project that is extremely new, but I'm telling you about it from the beginning because it can only succeed if it is co-produced from the very, very start. It's a project that uses citizen science, and our goal is to improve society and empower autistic people. And we watched the video together, and we already heard from the previous talk about the fact that 9 out of 10 autistic people have differences in sensory processing. And we also heard about this work that was done by Autistica to collect together about 10 research priorities, key priorities, to identify 10 questions that the autistic community would like to have answered, would like researchers to answer. And one of those, question 5, is this one about which environments lead to the best outcomes for autistic people. And so where I come in as a data scientist is thinking about whether we can use citizen science to tell us about how autistic people navigate the world around them. And if you haven't heard of citizen science before, the idea is that anyone can be a scientist. Anyone can take part in answering important questions. So it involves people who are not necessarily paid to do science. They might be paid for their other jobs. Hopefully they are. And our goal is, one of the key benefits of citizen science is that if you have the data science tools that allow us to do things at scale, on a global scale, really quickly from our phones, you can engage with so many of these people. And it's a big, it's a sort of continuing to grow way of collecting information. It benefits researchers very, very clearly, because you have huge amounts of scale, scope, variety, and ease. So if I send a little app, a little game out into the world, and I ask 1,000 people to do it every single morning for me, that's incredible. That's way, way easier than actually meeting with every individual person in a sensory room and doing kind of the really important, laborious research on an individual level. It doesn't always benefit participants, though. It can often be as quite a sort of utilitarian way of having people do the work, but keeping the power and keeping the decision-making within the research community, sort of as it always has been. And so our goal is to design a scalable citizen science platform released to the public, so anyone can use it, which autistic people and others will use to input data on how they navigate different environments. And the goals, there's a bunch of goals. We're trying to do a lot of things. So one is to use the project to create a new dynamic for the research process that specifically empowers autistic people. So really trying to break down this idea of scientist as expert and non-scientist as person who provides the expert with the information, really trying to flip that on its head. We want to gather information to help us understand autistic people's experiences. So that's a research question. And we want to try and apply some of those information, the information that we learn, to adapt environments. So we already have people who, we haven't actually started the project yet, but we already have people from the fire service in London who are interested, the Barbican Theatre, who are interested in making their spaces more accessible. And this is, I'm not autistic, and this is something that I am really, really passionate about, is that I would love to use this project to educate non-autistic people. It's a much more important goal to educate the non-autistic people about what they could do or about the diversity of experiences. For me personally, that's more important than the research question. But sometimes you need to put a little research label on something to get people to pay attention. We're quite interested in building something that looks a little bit like a social media site where people would be able to share strategies. So if one person may have particular challenges taking the tube, the Turing Institute where I work, we've run focus groups there, and they're super brightly lit and it's kind of noisy. So we just turn the lights out when we run our Autistica focus groups, and it makes everybody it puts everyone on an even playing field. And so potentially not just educating non-autistic people, but actually also educating workarounds for people within the autistic community. And we'd love for people, this is my personal dream, would love for people to feel less alone. I think a lot of what I took from a couple of the talks this morning is around the fact that actually the aspects of autism are not that bad. It's the mental health challenges that come along with not being respected, not being treated well, not having the services that can support you that are much worse. And so anything that we can do to try and have people feel a little bit less alone is a huge goal. We want to have, I've had a 3-minute warning, so I'm going to zoom through these. We want to have real world impact. We want to do work that is actually going to make a difference today, tomorrow, within the next year. It has to be participatory. Everything about the project has to be co-designed and co-produced with members of the autistic community. That's people with autism, autistic people, and also people who are parents and carers of autistic people. I put this in here because I know people find it really frustrating because it's the beginning of the project, and so I don't have a platform to show you. And I very purposefully don't have a platform to show you because it is not my role to design the platform. But I put this in here because for me, I imagine it being something that people are able to upload experiences, upload what I've been thinking of as stories of things that they found challenging, things that they would like to share with others, and things that researchers may be able to collect together at scales of 1,000 people sharing their experiences. We want to be transparent across the whole process. The data that we collect has to be maintained at the highest level of data protection and get appropriate consent from everybody. We actually want to give individual people control over their own data. So you're not handing us data that we promise to look after. We actually want to build a platform that gives you control over your own data. All of the code, so not the data, but all of the code and all of the processes and all of the work that we do to be able to actually build this platform will be open source, and anyone will be able to use it for any purpose that they so desire. That's not the case with the data. The data will only be shared if it is with research communities who share our values, and we'll develop a process through which we engage with as many people as possible to assess that. But the code will be available for anybody. We're going to build it on GitHub. This is what it looks like. It's super sad that it is currently a private repository because I am waiting on this one more piece of paperwork from the University of Cambridge. But when it is there, this is waiting for you to come along and read about the ideas that we have and then feed in your suggestions. We're really dedicated to diversity and inclusion, so we want to both remove barriers to inclusion and proactively support the inclusion of diverse groups. One of the things that citizen science should be able to do really well is allow access to people who would not traditionally be able to come across London to take part in a full-day focus group, for example. And we want to make sure that we keep a respectful environment and a supportive environment for everybody at all times. This is a group that we're hoping to work with. I strongly encourage that you check them out. They have very, very highly aligned values, and they're already giving individual people control over their data for whatever purpose. And I will finish, I'm so sorry, with this huge dream of mine, that we will build a community of autistic people and their families, and we will build a community of open source developers, people who will actually have software engineering or data engineering skills to be able to put that together. And I would love, love, love for us to have some autistic software developers who help us to do both. The bigger picture is that we have a citizen science platform that can be easily adapted to answer other research questions, and we have a participatory science framework that can also be adapted for more researchers to use a lot of the methods that are already in place in this community. So this is Autistica's vision. I'm sorry that I rushed through that, and I just want to thank everyone so much, and thank you for listening.
So one quick question.
I think it's a great idea, but it will exclude certain people, i.e. people with learning difficulties. My son couldn't complete the question earlier, but is there going to be a separate sort of way of identifying people whose parents or carers have actually supplied the answers?
So yes, so at the moment, the way that we've set this up is that we've got like a design phase where kind of anybody can input, and that information will be totally public, and so people are not going to necessarily be sharing terribly personal and sensitive information, but they might be sharing sort of suggestions and key points for us to pay attention to, which is effectively what your point is. I very much hope that the platform that we build will accept experiences from parents and carers who can represent the people who are not able to sort of submit their own experiences. The reason that I'm pausing is because I want to make sure that we build that in collaboration. So I think it is possible to build a space where parents and carers are able to report as proxies, and the only thing that we have to do the work on is making sure that we have processes in place to be confident about not violating the consent and agency of the individual person who has learning difficulties. So that's the difficult part for me, because if it's a remote participation, if people are doing this from their phones, from their commuting, or from the in front of the TV in the evening, it's difficult to actually assess whether you have well-meaning people who are responding on part of their loved one, or if they are violating that person's consent. And I hope very much that we're going to put a lot of work into building that out as a process that can safeguard against not excluding and not violating consent.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm going to have to move things on.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kirstie. That was really interesting. So, Philip, brilliant. You're already coming up. That's what we want to see. Efficiency. Oh, yeah, go for it. So this is Philip Beaman, and he's our third speaker.
Okay, so I want to change gear a little here and present something a little more personal. So I'm an experimental psychologist by training, but I also have a son who has autism and learning difficulties and is non-verbal. And if I can just show you a quick clip, hopefully this will work. So that's my son Joe in the bath, and he is non-verbal, but he sings an awful lot. And what I was interested in finding out was what music is like to him, and whether it's different from the way in which it is to me. I can't ask him because he's non-verbal, but I can try and ask some people, and perhaps try and bring, who are able to answer, and perhaps bring in some more insights from other directions. So I should say I've done this in collaboration with Alex Bacon, who's over there, and my colleague Fang, and she is supported by the European Research Council, but I very much piggybacked upon her Research Council grant here. So
music and language we know are separate but interrelated systems, and there are ideas in the scientific literature that people with autism might be more musically able in some ways than matched controls, despite sometimes having poorer language or different language abilities. And music therapy is often fairly heavily promoted. But what seemed to be missing from this was a sort of a first-person perspective on musical imagery. In particular, just sort of comparing, asking people, how does this sound and feel to you, versus someone else who doesn't have an autism diagnosis but is matched in other ways, and say, okay, what about you? How does this sound and feel to you? So I actually did some research a few years ago on earworms, which are songs that get stuck in people's heads. Okay, people like that research because it's something that everybody seems to identify with, barring one person who just looked at me blankly, but that she's the only person I've ever come across who has not had this idea. So, and there's a comment as well from Oakleford from 2015. This is a clinical observation. Having observed hundreds of children on the autism spectrum over the years, I've come to the conclusion that earworms are a relatively common feature, particularly in those with absolute pitch. Evidence of this phenomenon includes the frequency with which children repeatedly hum, sing, or whistle snippets of tune. So that was my son in the bath. He does that all the time, not just in the bath. Non-verbal, but lots of tune, lots of humming, lots of singing. If you look at the relationship between a questionnaire about auditory imagery and the number of times that people say, I get tunes stuck in my head, in a student-aged population, then you get a correlation between the number of times people say, yes, I get tunes stuck in my head, and how vivid they self-report their auditory imagery to be. You also get a similar sort of correlation between how much mental control they think they have and how much they hear. Okay, so those are our student-age controls. If we have a look at a direct comparison between people with autism and a control group, they're matched on various things here. I'll just show you that briefly. This is how well they say they're hearing, how vivid imagining sounds are. So this is environmental sounds, waterfalls, birdsong, musical sounds, and speech sounds, voice sounds. And you can see here that the control people are always saying it's more vivid than the ASD group. On another auditory imagery questionnaire, exactly the same thing. So from that, one might think that, okay, the people who score higher on the auditory imagery in my normal population are the ones who are self-reporting the more earworms. Here we have some evidence that if you give people the same questionnaires, the autism group are self-reporting less control, less vividness about this sort of thing than the control group. What do they do about the earworms? The answer is that statistically there's no difference there, but actually numerically they're certainly not producing more earworms. So what we have is kind of a little bit of a conundrum in a way. I've got some evidence that if you actually give people standardized psychometric tests of auditory imagery, then you have a reduction in the autism group compared to the control group. And yet, if you actually ask the same people about autism using an autism, beg your pardon, about earworms using an earworms questionnaire, you don't get that relationship that you get in my student-aged population. So it looks as though something about the music is picking up different auditory systems in some way in the two different groups. What that is, I don't know. I think I had a 1-minute warning a few seconds ago, so perhaps I'd better stop there. And if anybody can answer this conundrum for me, that would be lovely. Thank you.
We are slipping quite a bit over time, so I
Sorry.
think I might have to not have questions at this junction, just so we can stay on track, and perhaps if we catch up time, we can have some general questions at the end, if that's all right. So could Bill come up? Bill Davies is going to be our next speaker. Thank you so much, Philip.
Hi, I'm one of the 5-minute people, so I'm going to try and be really quick. I don't usually mention, I know we don't usually mention academic rank, but actually the thing that you might find most interesting about this talk is that I'm both a full professor and I'm autistic, which I know makes me fairly unusual. I'm not a professor of autism research, I'm a professor of psychoacoustics at Salford University. I have a lifelong restricted interest in sound, and so perhaps I feel lucky I didn't meet Jonathan Green at an early age. What I'm talking about, thank you. What I'm talking about here is a sort of progress report of a little unfunded project that's a collaboration between Cray, whom you probably know, and the Acoustics Research Centre at my place. I'm the PI, so I don't actually do any of the work. The work is actually done by one of my PhD students, Zuza, and Beth, who is Beth here? Put your paw up, Beth. No, she's not in. Oh, there she is, right at the back, hiding. Okay. So Beth is from Cray, Zuza from Salford. So the thing is about auditory perceptual capacity in an everyday scene. What do I mean by that? Okay, so here's an everyday scene, Manchester city centre. There are a lot of potential sound sources in this centre. In everyday life, we're surrounded by lots of different sound sources, and all of us, both autistic and non-autistic, are really, really good at navigating our way through these scenes. We can pick out one potential source of interest, even when there are multiple sound sources operating all of the time. It's actually really difficult to get computers to do that to the level of ability of humans. We can't quite do that yet, which is kind of interesting, but a side point. So we wanted to explore this this ability, and in particular, there's a really interesting results that my collaborator Anna Remington from Cray had published previously, which suggested that autistic people are actually better than non-autistic people at doing this. That is, when there are a large number of sound sources simultaneously happening, that autistic people might be better at picking out one target sound of interest than are the non-autistic people. I cheekily wrote to Anna and said I thought your paper was very interesting, but I didn't like your experimental method and I could improve it. Would you like to know how? And she said yes. And so we ended up, she's very gracious about my rudeness. And so we ended up doing like this. So we don't take people out into the real world. That's too uncontrollable. Instead, we reproduce a realistic sound scene over a spatial audio sound system in our laboratory. We have several possible positions for the primary target sounds that we're asking people to identify, and also several positions for an additional sound source which is going to be present some of the time. So these can happen all around the listener. We have two tasks for our listeners. The primary task is, did you hear a lorry or a bike? When it's just that sound on its own, that's trivially easy. When we start introducing more and more sounds simultaneously, and they're different sounds, but still realistic ones, the task gets harder and harder. So basically we're manipulating the perceptual load on people, and we're trying to saturate their perceptual capacity. When we're presenting 6 sounds simultaneously, we're hoping that we've saturated these people's perceptual capacity. the thing is that when we actually have saturated their perceptual capacity, or some of the time, we introduce a second task, which is also, did you hear an ice cream van at any time during this? Our hypothesis is that the autistic group will be better at detecting this secondary task, which is further away, the secondary sound, than the non-autistic people. I'm going to skip through this because I've been given a 1 minute warning. I have some results to show you, but just this is very teasy. I only have results from the non-autistic participants so far, but they do show, I know, sorry, but they do show that our manipulating perceptual load on the horizontal axis is working in the way that we suspected, that they are getting worse at detecting that secondary ice cream van. So yeah, making the task hard enough in a realistic scene turned out to be difficult. But my main conclusion for you here is that I need more autistic participants. So Zuza and Beth would like me to recruit some more people. Sadly, the catch is that you have to come to my lab in Manchester to take part. So it might not be much use to any of you. But there we are. That's it. Thanks.
Quick question.
Were the frequency bands, were they very different for the different sounds, or was there a lot of overlap?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, the spectra. So the task of picking out one sound out of several others. You'll know this from your own research. I suspect that there are multiple cues that we can use to do that. And if we use realistic sounds, then there are quite a lot of those. Yeah, we decided not to manipulate the spectra of those sound sources. So yes, so there will be different spectral cues available to participants for those different sounds. The loudnesses are all equalised though, so they can't use loudness as a cue.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I'm being so strict about the, but I'm taking my job very seriously with this timekeeping, as you can tell. So the next speaker is our penultimate speaker, is Isabelle Verhulst. So if you'd like to come up.
Thank you.
That's mine. Right, let's move this.
Hello everyone, my name is Isabelle. I'm here to present my master dissertation findings to you today in 10 minutes. So if I go a bit quickly, it's because I don't have a lot of time, like many of the other speakers. So we'll go through who I am, a bit of background about the research, some of the findings, and then there'll be a little bit of time for questions, hopefully. Ooh, hang on. So personally, a little bit of background information on me. I'm a mum of 2 children. Both of them have ADHD, and one of them has been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And when he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, I thought, I recognize a lot of that. So I was diagnosed myself a year later with Asperger's syndrome as well. From a work point of view, I come from a marketing background and have recently been retrained into clinical psychology, and that is why I did my master's dissertation here at Reading University. And I will tell you a little bit more about my findings right now. So what we looked at is really the perceived causal relationship between how people with autism experience the world through their senses and anxiety, so different anxiety disorders. So from the sensory point of view, we know there's a lot of sensory processing differences that autistic people might have, and that can be either hyperreactivity, where people experience input more strongly than neurotypical people would, hyporeactivity, which is where they experience the world and sensory input a little bit less impactful or not at all, and sensory seeking, where they're so interested in experiencing input that they might actually go look for input, like touch things and things like that. And that can be across all of the sensory domains. So I looked at those three types of reactivity, but also asked people about sensory domains. So are we talking about vision, touch, sound, interoception, all those different domains? And why I did this research is because we know that both sensory reactivity differences and anxiety are highly common in autism, but there wasn't a lot of research yet about the causal relationship between the two. So we know that people might have both sensory reactivity and a certain type of anxiety, but which drives the other, which is the cause rather than the effect of the other. So that relationship, especially perceived by autistic people, is what I looked at. So the research setup, we did an online questionnaire with 240 autistic adults, and their average age was 41. And they had a fairly high education level on average, so at least primary education, which means that from a DSM-5 point of view, these people would be likely to have a level 1 ASD rather than 2 or 3. So just keep that in mind, how you interpret the findings. So the measures that we used, we first screened for autism. We asked if they had a diagnosis, and then we gave them the AQ10 to just double check if they, have autism. And we gave them both a sensory questionnaire and an anxiety questionnaire. So we could look at correlation, regression. The most interesting questionnaire from my point of view is the perceived causal relationship questionnaire, which basically means that we asked these autistic adults, what do you think about the sensory differences that you experience in your life and the anxiety types, for example, generalized or social, etc., in your life, only the ones that you feel you have. Which do you feel causes more the other than the other way around? Sorry, it gets a little bit complex. So what we did is we looked at correlation, regression, and also I analyzed the perceived causal relationship data. I'll show you the results now. So if you look at the total level, so total sensory reactivity and total anxiety, the autistic people told us that they actually influence each other to a similar extent. So if, for example, we asked people, do you think your sensory reactivity causes your anxiety or your anxiety causes your sensory reactivity? They say yes to a similar extent at the top line level only. Because if you then dig into the detail, if you ask more about the sensory reactivity types and the sensory reactivity domains, there's some differences between cause versus effect that start to emerge. And remember, there were large differences between participants. So it's not, there's no one answer that obviously counts for everyone. So if we look at the sensory types, which is the hyper, hypo, and sensory seeking, 2 of those were perceived as more cause or effect of anxiety than the other way around. And that was hyperreactivity was seen to be more a cause of anxiety than the other way around. So if people were, if they were bombarded with input that they experienced as too much, that would increase their anxiety rather than the other way around. For example, if they were put in a social anxiety-provoking setting, that didn't seem to trigger their hyperreactivity as much. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah. The sensation seeking was more an effect of anxiety. So if people get more nervous, more anxious, they tend to look for sensory input. And I think, although we didn't ask for that, which we could do in a future study, I think that's stimming. So when people get nervous, they might, fidget or tap or hum, things like that, just to reduce their anxiety levels. It's a self-soothing behavior. At least that's my hypothesis. If we look at the domains, only 2 of 7 domains were different on the cause versus effect with anxiety. So auditory sensitivity was causing anxiety more than the other way around, whereas tactile sensitivity was more an effect of anxiety. So again, if you get more anxious, people want to touch, might become a little bit more sensitive about their touch. So the key point here is, if you just, for the researchers out there, if you just ask people about sensory reactivity and anxiety or variables like that, and you stick to the top line level, you will lose a lot of interesting information. Yeah, this is where the significant differences are at the lower level, the type and the domain level. We didn't find these differences, by the way, on the anxiety side. So the social anxiety, generalized anxiety, etc., we didn't find those differences there. So again, the relevance, I think it's important to know that, for example, when we develop interventions for autistic people, for anxiety and or sensory, we need to know that the relationship between the two is bidirectional, i.e. they will influence the other. So if you want to really help people, it might make more sense to work on both rather than one only. Second thing is what I mentioned before, we have to be careful not to stick to the top line level. We have to dig deep enough to get those differences. And the third thing is the PCR questionnaire, the perceived causal relationship questionnaire that I used with the autistic adults. It is a great tool to ask these people what they think the causal relationship is between two variables. They can actually use that tool, they can answer that type of question. So I think it's an interesting tool that we now have as researchers to use with the autistic population. We can use it with, try to use it with other groups, for example, groups with level 2 or level 3 autism. Can try it with children, although we'd have to change the PCR questionnaire to something a little bit easier to understand for children, but definitely there's room for future exploration in there. And I would like to thank Teresa Tavassoli, my supervisor, for helping me through my dissertation project. And that is what I have time for. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hiya. That's really interesting. I was just wondering if you had the numbers to look at sex differences.
I looked at sex difference if it was a variable that influenced these things, and it came out as not really. So there wasn't a massive difference in sexes or in age groups or anything like that. They weren't variables that drove massive differences. The only thing that was very impactful was the uncertainty, being uncomfortable about uncertainty. That is a confound in this setting to keep in mind. So it was called intolerance of uncertainty, and I had a questionnaire about that as well. And that is an absolute variable that came out of the multiple regression analysis that I did. So that's one to keep in mind in this kind of research.
So that's driving those associations?
It is a variable that has an impact on the relationship between sensory and anxiety. So it has a massive influence. If I take that out of the equation, a lot more of the domains and the types get a significant difference between cause and effect, but when I put it back in, some of those disappear. So I just showed the ones that, even if I take IU into consideration, they are still significantly different cause versus effect.
Unpredictability is quite a big factor.
It is. Totally. Yes?
Hi. So self-report, of course, can be fallible and can reflect a developmental endpoint in relationships between problems and measures. So I'm wondering, given those limitations, potentially, what are the next ones?
Well, that's a really good question. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly if I will be doing this, because I'm now changing roles, but I think someone else who can take up the baton and look at other types of measurement, different methods, I think that's a really good valid point, because all I did was use self-report. So both for the sensory, the reactivity, and the perceived causal relationship, it is all self-report. On the other hand, I did use the standard validated questionnaires and the perceived causal relationship one, which was individually tailored. and those different types of input, although they were all self-report, the findings were very similar. So where the significant differences were, if I looked at the questionnaires or asking people, what do you think is the causal relationship, they were very nicely in line. So the standard questionnaires being in line with the perceived causal relationship questionnaire actually helps to validate that tool. But obviously there's a lot of work that needs to do to look at different methods to look into that relationship. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was
You're very
really
welcome.
fascinating. So we've just got time for our final speaker now. It's Teresa Tavassoli.
Hi, I actually got very excited because someone else just opened the slides before. I was like, someone else will do it. I was like, but no, you have to listen to me now. So I'll also talk about the topic of sensory activity in autism, which is a topic I've been interested in for a long time. And before I start, so if I can't finish due to time, I wanted to thank everyone who makes my research possible. So Autistica, as you heard in the morning from James, has actually funded my PhD and is also funding my current work, and Q as well as a funder currently. And also I want to thank all the families who took part and made this research possible, and my brilliant students, so Karen, Tim and Isabelle, who you just heard from, and other collaborators. Okay, let's get started. So just generally about my research approaches, I think it is really important to work with the autistic community, but also to talk to families, to talk to autistic adults, to see what type of research should we be conducting, and to help with developing ideas. I am using, for phenotyping, so to look at sensory activity, I'm using questionnaires and observations. And one take-home message really is, I think we should use both, if possible, questionnaires and also direct observations as well to measure sensory reactivity. We are also using more psychophysiological measures, so to see how sensitive someone is, we're using heart rate and skin conductance. And all these kind of phenotyping measures, I think, are really important, and a first step to then look at underlying mechanisms, but also to look at impact. So what we just heard, is there a link between sensory activity and anxiety and mental health? And that's really what I wanted to talk about. Two things today is, one is, how can we measure sensory activity? Because that's, I think, one of the questions I mostly get. And then the second part is, what is the impact? So the link to mental health symptoms. And for the first one, I think just to, if possible, try to use a combination either of a parent report or self-report, but also direct observation. And then also for the impact, I think it's important to know that it doesn't just, there is an impact of sensory reactivity symptoms or differences that might be linked to mental health symptoms. And also we look at challenging behaviors, for example, as well. And I think what's really coming out of the research right now is as well that it is what Damian said as well. It could also be a really beneficial, yes, for example, seeking can be very beneficial and could be, for example, a coping strategy or soothing. So it is really different and not necessarily something that is seen negative. Okay. We heard this. Why is it important? I don't need to go through this anymore. It's really one of the most debilitating symptoms. Sometimes, for example, that's what Temple Grandin is saying herself. But we also heard that it can be beneficial. And again, just to highlight the diagnostic criteria, and we talked about what is hyperreactivity, hypo, and seeking. So I don't need to discuss that either, which is great. I just wasn't sure, will it be mentioned before, won't it be? So better have a slide in there. So first question, how can we reliably measure sensory activity? And to do so, what I did is I compared a questionnaire, which is the most widely used questionnaire, the sensory profile. So if you go to any conferences or talk to autistic, I think it's often used. So the sensory profile has items such as, so this means a parent report and direct observation. So parent report, for example, ask, my child reacts emotionally or aggressive towards touch. And I wanted to see, so if we're using a parent report, how much does this line up with directly observing a child as well? So for this I used the sensory processing scale observation also called SB3D. They change their name on a regular basis, but I think currently it's SB3D. And I was trained at the Star Center by two OTs, Lucy Miller and Sarah Schoen. And what you do here is you just play different games. And you observe behaviors. For example, you say, please look at the spinning wheel for 20 seconds, then you say stop. And then you have different sounds. And what you want to look at is you want to see, for example, seeking behavior. So you spin a wheel. Might a child really be intrigued by this and get closer to it? You present different sounds. Is this, for example, might a child put their hands over their ears, or they will not respond at all if you have an unexpected sound? And what we found here is that, first of all, parents report more sensory symptoms in autistic kids and also in kids who are otherwise typically developing compared to when you do a direct observation. And when you look, so we had 81% of the kids, the autistic kids meeting on the sensory profile and 65% on the direct observation. When you look at the overlap, so you ask, if I use a questionnaire, what are the chances that I also pick up the same child with an observation? And I was surprised, it's actually 74% of the time. So 74% of the time, if you use a questionnaire or direct observation, you kind of get the same answer for generally sensory symptoms. However, in another study that is not published yet, we had over 170 kids for this study, and we looked at not just overall sensory symptoms, but you look at what we just heard before. You go a little deeper and you look at tactile hyperreactivity or overresponsivity. The overlap is only 50%. So basically, if you use a questionnaire or you use a direct observation, really matters, because you will identify a very different group of children, which I think is really important for research, but also for clinical use. Might also explain why we often see different results, because sometimes we use a questionnaire, other researchers use direct observations. So just the take-home message from the first part is that if you're just interested in sensory symptoms, overall the overlap is relatively good between questionnaires and observations. However, if you're more interested in, for example, one modality, so touch, and one subtype, hyperreactivity, the agreement is relatively low. So what I usually recommend is to say, use a direct observation and a questionnaire to identify your group and to say, this child might have sensory overreactivity or not. Second, so the impact. Right now I'm exploring a little bit more if someone has, for example, is oversensitive or has seeking behaviors, is this linked to mental health, adaptive functioning, or family life as well? And I often think it's important to keep in mind that if you have early sensory symptoms, so for example, you might be quite oversensitive to the environment, it can have an impact on later life. So there are studies saying if you're oversensitive, maybe later there's a higher chance that children also develop anxieties. And what always gets me is if parents try to get OT, they try to get support, and then they're just told, they grow out of it. And actually just an anecdote of my own life, my daughter, she is not autistic, but she's very sensitive to sounds, and she also didn't speak at nursery. She spoke a lot at home, not at nursery, and I was a bit like, as a psychologist, it's like, oh, is this selective mutism? She was very little, but the GP just told me it's because she's bilingual. It's like, no, there's no research saying that. And so I still went out and got like some assessments and just little tips like go to the nursery, sit with her for 5 minutes at the end of the day, and then after 6 weeks she started talking. So I was happy that I continued to search, but it's really, and it must be very frustrating as well as a parent. So yeah, don't like, sometimes someone doesn't grow out of it and has an impact on daily life. And so one theme of my research is right now looking at sensory activity and the development over time, and we're measuring sensory activity at age 3 to 5 and then following the kids as well. That's actually my daughter there. Poor child, and this is live stream recorded. Anyway, and she couldn't even give consent yet. But this is part of this theme. These are slightly older children, and this work was done by Karen. Sorry. my PhD student. And what we looked we looked at the link between sensory activity subtypes and anxiety subtypes. We had 41 autistic children, and we used parent reports. So, for example, for anxiety, the SCAS. So, my child has difficulty stopping herself from worrying. But we also asked children themselves with something called the Dominic Interactive. Have you heard of that, or anyone in yeah? So you ask children, you say, Dominic is happy at home. Do you feel the same? Yes or no? Dominic's worries about their being separate from his parents. Do you feel the same? Yes or no? And what Karen found was that there is a link between sensory hyperreactivity and phobia, so physical injury fears, which is a phobia, and specific phobias. And that's a result when you take into account autistic traits. When you don't take into it, there are actually more relationships, but we felt it was important because overall autistic traits are linked to sensory symptoms and anxiety. So you need to control for it. But what was quite nice is that sensory, being more sensitive, was linked to phobias not only on a parent report but also on the direct self-report from the children. And we saw the opposite then with hyporeactivity. So basically the less hyperreactivity, the more hyporeactivity, the less anxiety. Yes, that way. So for total anxiety and social anxiety. Okay. And then just broader, so we are starting to look at the link between sensitivity and anxiety, but also broader mental health, because there's been very little research on this topic. And there we go, Tim Russo is also my PhD student, is leading this part of the project. So again, we follow children from an early age, but this project was looking at cross-sectional data from around 90 children. And we used, for this one, we just used parent reports. So I know 10 minutes ago I said use parent reports and observations. Now I'm just, but this is, the data was already collected, so I couldn't change it. But we used the sensory profile. Again, for example, my child is distracted by noisy settings. And the child symptom inventory, which looks at ADHD, anxiety, depressive symptoms. And just one take-home message here, and there's a poster 23, I think, as well, where you can ask further questions, is that autistic kids scored higher for mental health symptoms. And I think that's in line with what we heard this morning that by Professor Beresford, who said that 80% of the autistic adults actually scored higher on mental health symptoms. And we saw something similar across different conditions. And we also, when you then look at sensory seeking, kind of hyperactivity and sensory sensitivities, there were correlations. This is a slightly overwhelming table. But also what we see a lot is there are negative correlations with seeking. So the more seeking someone is showing, the less mental health symptoms. And I think, thinking about the last talk we just heard, is it could potentially be that it could be a coping strategy, or it could be that needs are not met enough. So the take-home message here is that, yes, sensory activity symptoms are linked to mental health symptoms. And we really need to look more like for screening tools for sensory sensitivity and mental health in autistic individuals. And I think what's important is as well that, especially for mental health, we need to also think about ways to measure mental health in kids who are non or minimally verbal. Because there's a high percentage of kids who are minimally verbal who might also be anxious, but it's a little bit harder to find out. And I think there's really great research going on in this area as well. And then the other thing which I think is important, if we know that sensory symptoms, if a child is very overly sensitive to the environment, that might later lead to anxiety, or we know seeking actually can help and might reduce stress in children or adults, that can be really informative for developing targeted treatments as well. And thank you so much. Maybe there's time for questions. And I just have a few books that I usually recommend for families. So I really like Sensational Kids, that has tips that you can do at home, or kids. These are things you can do at school. So if you have a seeker wearing a heavy backpack, that might be calming. I'll just leave this up here. Okay.
question?
I think that's really interesting, the research you're doing, and because there's so many different ideas around how to treat sensory issues, and the evidence base isn't strong enough. But I know from talking to different parents that some parents find certain things useful for their children, and other parents don't. So the fact that the evidence base is being grown is good.
Yeah, always what I say to parents, I mean, to every, you have to become kind of a sensory detective to really think about also for yourself, like what are things you like, you don't like, and the same for your child, because it's every child is so different that you really, and you're kind of the real expert as well,
I just say predictability and control is coming up time and again is, from a personal experience, very important. But things can be predictably awful as well. So if you know a stimulus you're not going to like, for me there's tons of it. Parmesan cheese, be up the building. And this doesn't, you don't grow out of that either. It's you just learn ways of dealing with it, like running out the building. So any.
I'm a parent with two recently diagnosed children and a recently pretty much diagnosed husband, so it's kind of all chain in our house. I'm not academic at all, I'm actually here as a parent. Absolutely agree in terms of my son can be absolutely fine going to bed one evening, his duvet feels fine, he's had an incredibly stressful day the next day, and the duvet is, you know, like catching on him. And I think there's a severe lack of understanding, especially myself 6 months ago, used to be like, oh, get the shoes on, come on, we'll be okay. And it's not that at all. So I think there's a real understanding and education around that. And my father-in-law was around the other day, sort of started tutting and rolling his eyes as he was putting his trainers on and not his school shoes. And I said, it's really, really serious. And sort of explained about it. But like somebody else said, it's not recognised. And I think there's a lot of, I just think people don't really understand it. You don't suffer from it yourself, it's very difficult. My husband does. But then the three of them together, it almost doesn't work because my son's making strange repetitive noises. My husband can't cope with that. And it's all really difficult.
I think we try a little bit, at least for the Center for Autism, to also increase awareness. So I talk to nurseries as well, because often I go to a nursery and they have this poor child who's screaming and they're like, oh, it's just behavioral, it's just like misbehavior. It's like, no, there is just someone in the garden and doing gardening and it's so loud and we don't really know what it sounds like for her. So I think that's really important. And actually there's really good research on sleep disturbance too, and just for everyone, and looking, but it is also, I mean, sensory doesn't explain it all, of course, but it does, like, I think it's particularly tactile and auditory oversensitivity. So the feel of the duvet and like sounds could really be linked to waking up more at night and things.
Partly experiential as well. So what you learn is like and dislike. So say animals, like my son loves horse riding, but both of us are very avoidant of dogs because of the barking and so on. And some people absolutely love animals, sensory seek them all the time. And it can be one extreme to the other.
That's actually the dog barking, I think, for the specific phobias, that in particular for anxiety, things like sensory triggers are quite commonly seen, Okay, I feel like I should stop. Should I stop? I feel like it's lunchtime, but I'm around. Oh, no, sorry. Is it lunchtime? Is it one more question? What do we think?
We've got time for probably a couple more questions. If anybody wants to ask one to a different speaker, given that I know Chris didn't have a chance. So
maybe for,
questions. We've probably got time for one or two.
Yeah, I think that what's missing at the moment is a society problem. It's not us being, I'm an autistic adult, I've got major sensory issues. It's not just our problem, and it shouldn't be something that we're looking to cure.
No,
it's something we should be looking to alleviate. But as a society, we have a duty, because society is getting noisier, it's getting smellier, and it's getting more and more difficult to function as society is changing in those respects. And in effect, what we've got to do as a society is put brakes on it, do more research, like music in shops is a major problem, and we need to step back and we need to think more about the environment that we're
Yeah.
creating for in terms of inclusivity.
No, I 100% agree. There was a really nice workshop from Autistica last year where it was about the environment and how it could, and I think the navigation through the environment came potentially out of that as well. And I mean, the shops have sometimes like one autism or sensory friendly hour. I was like, that's very, I mean, it's a start if you want to think of it as positive, but why not have like the whole time like this and not just the 1 hour, but yeah, okay.
I have to draw things to a close, but I'd
Yes.
just like to add that actually those sort of environments are probably preferable for everybody, not just autistic people. I think that's
Yes.
worth considering.
Yeah.
We could all benefit from less smelly, bright, noisy
Yeah,
environments. So I'd just like to bring things to a close. Thank you so much for all our speakers. I think we should finish on time, and this has got quite a lot of central stuff going on here. I keep hearing that for a start. But thank you ever so much, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you to our speakers.